Good evening. My name is Hal Gage. Welcome to the second iteration of the First Monday art presentations. The format for tonight, as it is for each First Monday, is four presenting artists share their work for 15 minutes. Their topic and images are purely their own choice, and presenters are chosen simply by a first-come, first-served basis. I started this event as a way to reconnect after this long isolation with my fellow artists to share work and ideas. Our first presenter is Oscar Avelleneda-Cruz. He's a photographer living in Anchorage, Alaska. I've known Oscar for more than 20 years, and I've watched him climb the rungs of the photo biz to great success. His current interests are in social change and community building through art.
What I got for y'all today is what I hope is sort of a background story on what I think I discovered to be a process that I use to synthesize what I'm feeling into an expression of what I perceive my role is as an artist in society. So last year, I'm assuming everyone went through some sort of a paradigm shift experience. And I think in that free fall for me, 2020 really taught me that how I feel and where I'm at immediately relates to everyone around me. And in some form is of value, whether it's to myself or others. Just talking openly about what's going on has really helped. Anyways, so in this presentation, I hope you all walk away with this idea of a bit of a process of what I discovered to create a series of work that still to this day is kind of like building on itself. And I don't know where it's going, but that's sort of the nature of creative ideas these days. I feel like they take a life of their own and they just evolve. So I'm a father and I have two kids, a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, Ida and Rio. And clearly throughout my journey in life, I have an interest in sort of like activism and community. And so I've always realized subconsciously that through my roles, I actually end up exploring what it is that I'm doing or what I want to do. I never actually have a permanent idea. And it's extra fun because as a father, anyone here who's had kids, as they grow developmentally, you change yourself too. So these two kiddos have changed my life over the course of 2020. They also, in their little, very neutral, curious state, were pretty much caught, just like any one of us, off guard by 2020. We took them out of daycare, and obviously they had a bunch of confusion and stress around, just like all the change that we had ourselves. But one of the upsides to this was that we also had more presence with one another. My son, Rio, who you see there on the wooden bike, he got to learn how to ride so much sooner than I ever anticipated, because basically we were outside this time of year riding the bike, and we didn't get to do that before. And it was also special for me as a father because I got to visit places like in the background here, which is Lost Lake, something that I never actually have done as an Alaskan, because I've sort of been a late bloomer in that journey. I didn't realize how much of our state was actually accessible just through the road system and going out and exploring. But 2020 did also kind of give me the ability to witness sort of the glacial pace of life up here and the immense beauty that it has, because it's like, with all the noise and everything that was happening in 2020, I realized I appreciated the insulative qualities of nature and just open spaces that didn't change. They just stayed constant from one year to the next, or at least that's the way I experienced it. I also, at the time before in 2019, I was spending a lot of time kind of reflecting on where home was and what home looked like, because my own journey is one of a first-generation immigrant. And Alaska has been my largest kind of like identity imprint, because I've been here most of my life and a lot of my connections are here through the state. And anyone who's been in Alaska kind of knows we have a diversity of lifestyles and sort of households up here. So unknowingly, when I went back through my catalog of images, I realized I was collecting photos throughout the road system of where people live and what home kind of looks and feels like. And yeah, again, this kind of goes back to that place of feeling into the experience in my body of what that felt like in my body, because that's something I'm trying to use now as an artist more, is like what I feel like versus what I'm thinking. I have a tree out in Turnagain Arm that I visit with the kiddos, and that tree actually feels like a friend. So I've started creating connections with places that feel almost like neighbors. It's just at a greater geographic distance from one another. And it's fun because it's still part of Alaska, but I feel connected to it as though it's like my neighbor down the street. At the same time, last year also really opened up in my mind this, it's not like a responsibility, but it's almost like an awareness to who I'm being responsible for. A friend gave me this idea. She said her grandfather asked her, like, who are you bringing up the mountain? As sort of like an analogy for who you're taking responsibility for and who you're being accountable for. And that stayed with me because I know my own journey as a photographer and as an artist is really kind of like, I am just one of the individuals who came along the way because of folks like Hal Gage or the other photographers in the community who like played a role. And that's something very special about Alaska that I don't think I would have experienced anywhere else in the world, just because we have that small community experience. Last year also made me seek out a lot of silence because I couldn't deal with noise at all. There was a lot of mental health stress in both my household and in my family. And as much as I knew there was going on out there, but I unplugged. And honestly, I felt like the more I spent time in nature, the better I could actually hear others and feel into what I felt. And so that's a lot of what last year felt like for me. It's like, go seek isolation, be completely amongst like nothing, and then just feel into the energy when I entered back into society. And through it all, I kind of had this interesting fascination in Alaska with the history of Alaska, because the 20th century, I mean, has been just a fascinating time, and especially within the last 20 years with the internet and all. And Alaska's history is so brief. So as of recent, I've even picked up an interest in reading some of the memoirs, letters that Elmer Rasmussen wrote, just because it's fascinating to understand Alaska from another person's perspective. And our recent history here just makes it that much more accessible. So anyways, what I want to give you all right now is a intro into what I discovered was my creative process to synthesize ideas and get to somewhere that I wanted to be with this body of work that is still ongoing. So what I started with is looking and contemplating at things that were real and absolute, but no longer true. In this case, this building you see was where I had a temp job working at a accounts payable department. It was one of the first places that I visited when everything shut down because I was curious to see which cars were in the parking lot. I also went and I visited places that had some sort of memory to me. They were also real and absolute, but they didn't have, like, I didn't have such a grasp around them, around what they were. And I was more open to having almost like a creative story come from just visiting the place. In this case, it was Hatcher Pass. And this was in April. There's still quite a bit of snow. I also became really attuned to this idea of pretending like I had the consciousness of other objects. And so, for example, I imagined myself being like a rock or pretending to be a shadow and just being in an environment. If it sounds like I just kind of sat around and like did a lot of watching, that wasn't entirely my life in 2020, but it was what I sort of like did on my spare time because it felt rejuvenating to just kind of sit and watch. Having that role as a father and also the kiddos really gave me a sense of play as well, which I think is incredibly, one, healthy, and two, needed, because processing that energy of like everything going on was necessary. For me, a sense of play has always been a great release in terms of like what else is possible. Otherwise, I could become very sort of like cognitive and focused on one area. And then I sort of start to frame everything in a very limited way. So having a sense of play and like kinetically moving through an environment actually helps me. Likewise, I think this is the other big discovery of 2020 was allowing myself to go through the big experiences of all the feels, like big, deep feelings that don't always settle well, or that I don't know how to sit with. That really, really actually took me a while to kind of to work into. But after a bit, it became somewhat normal. Now I kind of feel like it's, it feels normal now. Having big feelings and sitting with big feelings is normal, including the big feeling of isolation and just sort of like the idea of being alone, but we're not really actually ever alone. It just feels like we are alone. And the more and more I've kind of gotten into that, I've realized that I'm almost always connected to someone or something, whether the tree or the light or the idea of my kids when they're with my co-parent. There's always this connection to something. And so it starts to feel less isolating, even though I'm still, in a state of like being alone when I'm exploring those moments. The other thing that helped me kind of like synthesize the experience of creativity recently has been really getting into sort of like hyper presence of a moment. I had this really fun barbecue with the kids last year, and I just remember going over the top with it because I'd never had a barbecue with such intention. It was just something I never did growing up, and it was fun to actually play into that to such an extreme. And this day was one wonderful example of that because it was so hot and bright. And then again, this practice of going back to silence and just kind of like listening and feeling into my body to see where I was and what I was picking up on. Because more and more over 2020, what I realized was like I could kind of pick up on an energy around myself or around others, around conversation. And based on that energetic feel in my body, I decided whether it was something I wanted to be around or something that I wanted to move away from. And again, stepping back into the role of fatherhood, because one thing that I've discovered over and over is that the more present I become with the roles that I'm committing to, the deeper my journey gets in terms of discovery with myself and others, depending how far the journey goes, whether it's a creative journey or working with another artist, or in the case of the kids, learning how to basically become more of like a 21st century parent with them. Because that's also something very new to me. I was very much parented in the 20th century manner, which is totally different. So yeah, a lot of fun experiences there. Okay, so here's a little bit of a formula that I found out to discover this body of work that I'm still working on now. I went on a walk. There's this street in West Anchorage called Wildwood Lane, I believe. And the fun thing about the street is that every house is based kind of on the 20th century, like a year. It's like 1900, 1936, 1940. And I went on this walk and I kept one thing constant. That one thing that was constant was my hand in this object. And I changed where this object was in relation to the environment. And what was fun about it too was that as I walked down the street, I was also allowing myself to experience and imagine and recall memories. And if I didn't have a memory from that exact decade related to the house number on the street, I would imagine and recall what it was like to be part of a moment in history in that year. And what was fun about it was this little exercise of keeping an object constant and changing the background had me almost change the lens in which I viewed it. Not just visually and colors or objects, but also kind of how I related to it. In this case, this house in the background is the 2020 house. And so that's the address, 2020 Wildwood Lane. But it was fun for me to almost look at it because it felt like a playful interaction with 2020, the year. The other fun thing about this process was that it allowed me to really get into the nuances of color. I realized I didn't actually have a good awareness for the variety of color in Alaska, because there's always this criticism that we don't have 4 seasons and we don't really get to experience like a full range. But if you actually stop and look at things in great detail, you realize there's an immense amount of color. We're just not really conditioned for it because we tend to experience things in such limited realities. So this little exercise of keeping one thing constant and then changing the background really helped me. I also, again, going back out into nature and just kind of like really sitting with one location. This was out on the second hike to Lost Lake. And I never just kind of looked at shadows in detail. And it felt like a whole nother world. And those kind of moments where I realized I've never fully sat with the experience of nature really kind of grounded me a little bit more into what I'm doing now. Likewise, in the winter, this was an image that I took up in Delta, Alaska, and just the snow drifts and how it changes the landscape of the snow is something that's now started to captivate me. And last but not least, I've come to connect this idea that it seems like we're all sharing this culture. We're sharing this place, Alaska, the experience of Alaska, or our experience of an environment together. And I've taken almost like a third person perspective, again, imagining myself to be like a rock or part of the landscape and witnessing how we all like participate with it. In this case, it was a massive ice cave. I forget what it was called, but you could walk all the way into the back of it. It was very fun and pretty eerie. Okay, so from that exploration of how to kind of experience things and feel into my body, I came up with some rules. I was like, okay, if I photograph anything that's man-made, I want it to be inverted. I wanted an absolute rule around man-made objects. To me, that was just a rule that I wanted to create moving forward so that for this body of work, I followed one specific rule. The other rule I had was, since I was feeling into everything with my body, I had no exact rule around what what the final outcome was. I just simply wanted to have a circle and a rectangle, because that idea of keeping something consistent was the circle, and then letting the two interact with one another, the circle and the outside of the circle. Wait, that wasn't very clear. The relationship between the circle and the rectangular part was something that I realized could become its own sort of like conversation. And what I wanted to do was keep it open so that I could explore what happens. So sometimes I was exploring color. Other times I was literally just exploring things that I missed. In this case, I missed the churros from Costco. I didn't realize they were gone. And other times, again, I was just really drawn to the smallest details of like winter, like January weather, where like you see the frost on everything. This body of work also taught me to, this process taught me to really watch the colors. I realized there's actually a ton of colors in the winter, even though it's all kind of this monochromatic look. Within the monochromatic, there's almost this variety of hues. And it just depends where you are, at what time, and what side of the mountain you're at to really see it. And texture. I didn't realize there was so much texture out there, to the point where I could go on a walk on a flat day and find the most amazing amounts of texture everywhere. I don't know how this image renders for you all on your side, but it's incredibly textured with snow. And sometimes these things that were like daily photos, these were daily posts that I would do. They were just challenges to keep myself actively engaged with what I was doing daily and creating something. But like anything, as an artist, I get bored of following anything consistently. And so I got to deviate, and I explore random things, including, in this case, turning my son's face into what me feels like the moon. So it's sort of like a moon, and it kind of matches the lighting direction of the background. And again, I kept finding myself feeling into my body and hearing this like loud silence, sometimes associated with nature, sometimes not. But where I could catch it, I would try to take a photo of it. So sometimes it was looking at one particular direction in the sky and then combining it later with another landscape image. So that was another fun rule with this project, which was that I didn't always make it so focused that I had to match both photos for the circle and the background from the same place. They could come from like totally different locations and times of day. And that was okay, because it actually allowed me to explore what I was feeling, and whether I was exploring color or just the landscape. This one from Westchester is one of my favorites because it actually happened on the same day. The lighting and the background just happened to line up. And it was one of the first times I was, again, witnessing culture and the experience of culture just kind of being shared. In this case, in a hyper local geography through activities. I'm also doing something new here as an artist, and I'm showing you some images that I don't particularly care for. But I realize part of the process for me is now also sharing work that I'm not exactly really compelled to show, because I think the process of sharing it just also gives me a little bit more feedback around why I don't like it, or what maybe I'm asking it to do that it doesn't want to do. This is this image of the trees and the frost is one of my favorite ones. I actually got really good at going out and finding really quick details to put together in this circle rectangle setup. So much so that it became almost like a formula after a while. And that whenever I discover myself kind of like making creativity within a formula, I get bored of it. So I did, after basically February, stop doing this series just because I needed a break from it. I find that moving away from bodies of work actually helps me, because my subconscious still holds on to a lot of the aesthetics or the concepts. And then when I come back to it, I have a greater awareness for what I want to do with it, where it's going. Here's another example of me following that rule of inverting anything that was human made. This day, I don't remember exactly what day this was, but this is a significant day because it's the day I realized we could put the kids back in school, and that was a huge deal. So of course I had to celebrate that by making an image that related to it. So this one's very fun for that reason. We walked through my old neighborhood and collected books from little free libraries when I got that notice from the school. There is somewhat of a conscious relationship with the circle and playing into this idea of the moon or the role of the moon, because I tend to really navigate my life around the cycles of the moon. So sometimes I would create specific combinations where the idea was to make it look like a full moon through the objects. In this case, both being the sky, but by putting them together, they start to look like a moon. And after a while, I actually started seeing the circle as almost like I don't know, this form of consciousness that I could make appear anywhere. So I could actually start to just imagine it, make it float anywhere. So it's like in my mind as a photographer, how I've memorized the 35mm lens or 55mm lens, like field of view. Now I can now do that same thing with this process. I could take something and then create a circle and then put anything within the circle. So now that's like deeply embedded in my mind. And now I could, through my mind's eye, create that anywhere. That was an added benefit. I didn't know I would end up doing that at the end of this series. More interesting texture. Not one of my favorites, but let things shine. And yeah, in closing, a lot of this is still moving me towards exploring color and seeing where color takes me. So I'm even exploring this now as a digital medium too. So not exclusive to photography anymore. Thank you, everyone.
Our next artist is Ellen Davis. She's a photographer living in Nevada City, California. She lived in Anchorage for 18 years before recently returning to California. Her work ranges from alternative processes to traditional landscape. Tonight, Ellen is going to share her recent work at the Yuba River region in Northern California.
The Yuba River, it is one of my favorite places to photograph because it is it's a stunningly beautiful river and it is always inspiring to me. So tonight I'll be showing a mix of some highly polished work, some of my rougher images, a little bit of older work and some new work. And overall, I'm not sure where I'm going with all of it. But I live in Nevada City in the foothills of the Sierra Nevadas. The local geography has a lot of long ridges and rugged canyons, and this area was part of California's gold rush and its ancestral land of the Nisenan people. The Yuba River watershed has 3 forks, covers 1,300 square miles, and because the images are a bit of a mix, I'm going to present them geographically. I have spent a lot less time on the North Fork because it's a long drive and it's not quite as spectacular as the South Fork. I made a special trip for the dozens of cairns in one small area. These were very well done, and I loved the shapes and how each has their own personality. And I took these in the fall when the water was really low, and so it was easy to get out in the water. And this allowed me to get to these really low angles and get up close and catch this gorgeous gold that was reflected onto the water from the canyon above. This next shot is right out of the camera, and there was a branch stuck between the rocks. I left my tripod and camera set up in the river, went and kicked the branch loose, and realized almost too late that it was headed directly for my tripod. I got back just in time to grab the tripod, but I lost my balance and fell on my ass. Somehow I managed to keep the camera above the water, and soaking wet, I set it back up, and I was able to get one of my favorite shots of the Yuba. Now, the South Yuba River is spectacular. This is Bridgeport. The water has gorgeous green and blue jewel tones, and it winds around granite of all shapes and sizes. It changes every day. This shot is just more of a documentary image to kind of give you some context to the area. Because when I went through and reviewed all my images of the Yuba, I realized that I prefer taking images of the river that are less classic landscape and more tightly framed vignettes of how I experience and interact with the river. Now, I primarily stick with digital, but I do love going out with my Holga and with expired film to catch some of the really beautiful colors of spring. This tree is a red bud, even though it's purple. I photographed these bare branches in winter to test out my grandma's TLR camera from the 1940s. I just love that little bit of swirl in the bokeh. Sometimes you just have to stand back and enjoy the gifts of the river as they are presented to you. But back to vignettes. This rock is an example of how an image, it was more challenging for me to photograph than a broader landscape, just because it's stripped down to so few elements and it was very precariously balanced. And I honestly cannot get enough these golden reflections on the water, just because I feel like it alludes to the gold mining history of the river. And then this is a really beautiful example of the gold with the green jewel and tones and a little bit of teal in there. And this image, it's one of the few that actually has people in it. They're actually gold panning, but but it works for me because they just really blend into the river. They don't dominate the river. And this image is special to me because actually this was one of the first images that I took of the Yuba that I felt was really successful and connected with. And they just feel like little spirits or fairies. And those rocks are not photoshopped, by the way. So the Highway 49 bridge, it's a long and winding road that runs north to south through the Sierras, and don't expect to get anywhere fast. But where Highway 49 crosses the Yuba is one of the easiest points to access the river, and the old bridge is as iconic to the Yuba as the Eiffel Tower is to Paris. It was built in 1921, and now it's only used for foot traffic and the occasional wedding that you sneak in. But it's such an easy access point, so for swimming, hiking, and photography, but it can also be a very dangerous spot. I mean, obviously when the water is running high, when someone's dumb enough to get down on the rocks and get this close, but honestly, I was totally safe. But this is one place where I tend to stick to broader views rather than vignettes, just because it's a busier place and just everything around here is just so big. The bridge is big. The rocks and the boulders in this area, they're huge. And, some of them are just like size of houses and boulders. But so this sign I actually found really quite humorous because it's almost like an afterthought. It's kind of off to the side. It's about the same level as the railings. And honestly, if anyone's crazy enough to jump into the river anyway, that sign's not going to stop them. I wouldn't want to jump down in that. So what I really love about this image is just how the alpenglow catches onto the surface of the water, and then you get to see how it contrasts with that beautiful green. And I took this from at the same time from the river, but this is my attempt to try and get more of a vignette and trying to connect with this really, really big place. Like that boulder is actually the size of a vehicle. So it's hard to navigate. It's hard to get down there and really connect as close as I would like. But as I move away from the bridges and down the trail, I find it more relaxing. I find it easier to connect with the river and the land, which I find very therapeutic and restorative. Obviously, this last year has been rough, and I feel weirdly sympathetic for these rocks. Because I found myself in the right place at the right time to help my family's business pivot by creating an e-commerce website from scratch and pushing social media. And I took thousands of images for product photography, social media, and of course I'm happy to help my family, but it took a lot of my creative energy, and it was so hard to muster up and get out there and be creative or dive into the alternative processes that I really love. So going to the Yuba was just the easiest way for me to get out, do my own work, and because it's someplace familiar, it gave me a chance to unwind and to create without pressure. And sometimes you just have to take whatever baby step you can moving forward. On New Year's Day, I went out on a hike with a friend, and I made this image. I liked the symbolism of water adapting, flowing, and finding its way through the rocks, through the cracks and the hard places. And it made me feel like I could do the same. Be like water, be like Bruce Lee. Further upstream, Edwards Crossing is my second favorite place to photograph the river. The last bit of the road is narrow and it's mostly hair-raising hairpin turns. The Edwards Crossing Bridge was built in 1904 and is currently rated structurally deficient, but people drive over it all the time and it seems okay, so what do I know? The wood is unevenly spaced, the paint is peeling to expose the steel trusses to rust, and while walking over it, you hope that any cars you meet won't crunch you against the wonky railings. And when I make my way down to the water, I just pray I don't snap an ankle, because that's about as far as the trail goes, and then the rest you just scramble down and hope for the best. The real appeal of Edwards Crossing are two things. The color of the water, because it is especially beautiful. I love this opaque jade color, but it only lasted for a day before it changed again. The jagged rocks have a sculptural quality that has not yet been worn smooth by the waters, and puddles in the rocks are very, very common. You know, and honestly, I feel that most of my photographs of the Yuba are they're very pleasant, they're very well done, and they're not necessarily my most creative or innovative work. But I don't really give a rat's ass because I enjoy making them just as much as my most creative work, because we're back to the theme of being like water. And photographing the Yuba River is a lot like Tai Chi or meditation. My movements, they're slow, they're deliberate. I work the scene until I feel that I have plugged into it and I am able to focus almost entirely on practicing the fundamentals of photography. As I have expanded my skill set as a photographer, developed some serious post-processing skills, and love to experiment with some really wacky lo-fi techniques and alt processes, I feel that keeping the fundamentals sharp keeps me grounded and strong and help me keep developing as a photographer. I can easily spend 20, 30, 60 minutes working just one scene, getting the composition as finely tuned as I possibly can. And that's when then I go around and play with ISO and the shutter speed and the f-stop and my circular polarizer, if I remember it. Like this image, it was very tricky to find in the chaos. It was very limited with where I could move, and it just wasn't working. And it took a half an hour, but you know, it just finally clicked in. This is a sweet little creek that feeds into the Yuba. I know I just went on about the fundamentals, but sometimes I just have to shake it up a bit and work on the fundamentals of the whole and all its fantastic plastic film camera goodness. I make an exposure, advance the film a touch, take another exposure to overlap, and then when it's a very simple technique, and when it works, it creates these great panoramic images of a scene that does and does not exist. I always feel like the water is running backwards on this one, but it's actually not. So the little town of Washington, if you were to pluck it up and set it down in Alaska, it would not be out of place. An Alaskan friend said it reminds them of Chitina. If I go through town and down this narrow gravel road that scares off the crowds, it takes me to my favorite place to shoot on the Yuba. The water in this section is not quite as beautiful as Edwards, but it does come very close. I mean, in this green, it is absolutely real. I think it comes from the mineral serpentine, which is very abundant in the area, and it's a green color. And I just love the blue sky that is reflected in the water. But you can also see that this bit of the canyon runs very briefly north to south instead of east to west. So the way the light comes through the canyon at the end of the day creates some really interesting effects. It makes me miss the quality of light in Alaska. And these yellow trees, they are actually green, but the light is what turns them this brilliant gold that creates a dramatic contrast. They're evergreen trees, so it's, you know, even though it's fall. But yeah, this is my favorite example of that golden reflection effect that I just can't get enough of it. And this section of the river has some very nice swimming hole. This was actually taken a hot summer day when I went swimming. So the water runs still, it runs deep. It's bookended by rapids, and there's some beautifully sculpted rocks. All these elements give me a lot to work with. It's not a large area, but I always find something new and interesting to photograph, and I often have the place to myself. This place, it also lends itself nicely for these, these vignettes that I love. And the rapids at the beginning of and the end of the swimming hole are just enough to be interesting, but not so much that I can't get out into the water and explore what has changed since my last visit. Rock stacking is rather popular at the river. I don't do it, but I just like to photograph what others have done. This was an experiment I've wanted to do for a long time. It was just to see how light painting would work with LED balloons and what I would need to do to be able to control them without losing them to the river, which is not unlike fishing. But the real star of this area are the reflective qualities of the water. The still water and even lighting make excellent conditions for reflections. It can make single exposures look like double exposures that seem like portals to another world. In this image, it looks very simple, but I set up my shot and I waited for an hour before I got the right combination of light and stillness. Sometimes the stillness gives the image a strange dimensionality. I love the weird dimensionality created by the reflection of this rock. It's not an amazing image, but I just absolutely love that effect. Now this is a shot of the swimming hole in the deepest section, and hadn't done much with that until recently. So these last images that we're going to look at are my most recent work, and they are an abrupt shift from everything else I've done, and I almost missed it. I was waiting for the light to change just enough to start with the light painting, and while I waited, I just went and messed around by the deepest part, and I took a few shots of the reflection made by the geometric shapes of the rock face and the winter dead grass. And when I got home to process these images, I flipped them on their side, and I just went to town on the sliders in Lightroom, and that is all I did. There's little ropes out there. I didn't editing anything out. All I did was just basic editing. But I thought these were so cool, but I only had a few that were any good because I was more interested in the LED balloons. But because I know how quickly the river changes, I went back a day later with a telephoto lens and hope that the scene didn't change too much. I got lucky, and the only change was the green grass just barely starting to poke through that had gotten a little bit taller, and I spent several hours photographing just these reflections. And it was a good thing I did, because the next day there were a series of storms that had came through and it changed the landscape yet again. So there's not much left, so I'm just going to stop talking and we'll just sit back and enjoy the images. And this is the final image, and this is actually one of my very favorite. I think it looks like kind of like an Art Deco moth. All right, well, thank you very much. And that concludes my presentation.
Jane Terzis is a painter now living in Portland, Oregon. For 32 years, Jane was a perennial figure of the arts community in Alaska. She grew up on the East Coast, did her graduate studies on the West Coast, and ended up in Juneau, Alaska, until recently retiring. Tonight, Jane is going to share her life through art since her retirement.
A lot has happened in the last, I'd like to say 4 years. I'd like to say, but I will say that it's been a difficult time for the last 4 years. But I'm going to start a little bit before leaving Alaska. Way back to about 1957 or so. And this is me and my brother watching TV. And I was part of the first generation of kids to grow up with television and had a big influence on me and on the culture. And I think partly I owe being an artist to Winky Dink. This was a show in the early 50s, and Winky Dink is, of course, that star-headed boy. And if your parents were great, and mine were, they would send away for a Winky Dink kit, and it came with a film called a magic window that would stick to your television screen, and you got crayons with it. And I'll bet some of you remember this show. And you could draw along with Winky Dink right onto your TV. And then it had a magic eraser. You could erase that at the end. Really great. And, you know, looking at Winky Dink, the image of Winky Dink last night, I was realizing that his head shape might have something to do with this character. This is called Wild Thing at the Glacier. And Wild Thing is a character that I started drawing and painting about 20 years ago. And I've probably drawn and painted this personality over 100 times. And I never get tired of drawing and painting this guy. Sometimes it's a gal. And I think of this as my muse. Now here she is. In this case, her name is Virginia. This is one of a series of 52 small drawings that I did. And the title of the show was Prayer for the Protection of All Beings. This was during the US invasion of Iraq. And it occurred to me that if I could confess or admit my own qualities, positive qualities as well as negative qualities, then maybe I wouldn't be so quick to point a finger at people who weren't part of my group. And each of the drawings in this has one figure, at least one figure that has that face and that head shape. And when I first put this, showed this, I randomly labeled each drawing with a quality. And it went, I have the capacity for, and then I filled in the blank. And the one that landed on this was, I have the capacity to kill, the first time I showed it. And I watched people walk up to this and recoil away from it. The next time I showed this series, the subtitle that landed on this drawing was, I have the capacity for kindness, and people were drawn to it. In this show, underneath each drawing is an altar, a slate altar with a donated used bar of soap. And I solicited soaps from various places, the maximum security prison, a homeless shelter, a Republican politician, a Buddhist priest, a Catholic priest, an inmate, students, wealthy people, poor people, and a lot of soaps came anonymously. I ended up with over 100 soaps and I only needed 52. And they're gorgeous objects on their own, but also the fact that they've been on bodies of all different kinds of people and for purification, for cleansing. And this is an installation shot of a couple of the walls in that first show. I often paint children, and I think because kids, they are the whole package. What you see is what you get with kids. They don't, aside from pretending to be superhuman, they don't really pretend to be anything they're not. They haven't put on airs yet. And also, when we paint, my first memory that I can think of is in what we used to call nursery school, about this age, of this little boy painting. And I remember exactly the painting that I had done. And this is what, not only children, but I think everyone who does creative work, this is what we're doing. We're creating world. And the title of this painting is Painting. The process that I usually use is, I call these invented portraits. And what I mean by that is I typically find or take photographs and I'll scan them and I'll distress them to the point where I give a little bit of information, often compositing a head onto a different body, as I did in this case, and then making up a landscape to go with it. And as I'm painting particularly face, I get rid of the photographic reference at a certain point because I don't want the painting to be driven by the photograph. And I keep going until the character gets a personality and seems alive. This is called Salt of the Earth. I also like to play with the horizon line in some of these. And as you can see, this one, the horizon line is dropped down really low, which makes this boy, as tentative as he is, sort of like a giant, kind of monumental. I also photograph with my iPad at the end of each painting session. So I have the evolution of a painting to look at as I go. And a lot of these paintings really go through a lot of changes. I rarely end up with what I thought I was going to start with. A buddy of mine, shout out to Dan, gave me this photograph of himself with his calf Zelda, and I added the landscape and the extra pair of ears. I really am happy when paintings of mine feel like the character is about to move. And I also like when there's a bit of story with them. And I get a definite story from this. I named him Ramon. And my story is, for Ramon, is that his parents are calling him off the beach, and he is not happy about that. Another device that I borrowed from Holbein from the 1500s is to actually add some text to the painting. And in this case, this one is egg tempera. All the other paintings that you'll see today are oil. But this is a line out of Pinocchio by Jiminy Cricket, and the title of this is Pinocchio. Another thing I like to play with, is to juxtapose different characters on the same painting, a little bit separate. This is called Nothing Happened. I also borrow, if I like a character that I painted, I use them again and again, and both of these figures have shown up in several paintings of mine. This is clearly not an invented portrait, but I wanted to do a series of portraits of real people, but I didn't want to do commissions. I wanted to own the painting and be free to let these paintings, these portraits, go wherever they wanted to go. So I walked up to people. I had to travel to do this because I knew everybody in Juneau. I wanted to talk to strangers, people I knew nothing about, and I approached them and I told them what I was doing and asked them if they would pose for a very quick photograph. And almost nobody said no, which was very heartening and pretty amazing. And all that I knew about them was their name and their mailing address and where I took the picture. And for each of them, I sent them a print of their painting after the painting was done. And this is Danny Phillips, Community Swimming Pool, Madison, New Jersey. Alex, Ringmaster, Majestic Traveling Circus, Kmart parking lot, Juneau. Really elegant Russian man. Taylor, outside a Home Depot in Tampa, 1 month to the day after 9/11. Tony, in an amusement park in New Jersey. What you can't see from this painting, and I kind of like that you can't see it, is that he was pushing a baby carriage with an infant baby girl in it. This is back to invented portraits, feeling my way toward them. And again, juxtaposing different characters. This quote is from Nietzsche: "You must carry a chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star." And I know that everyone doing creative work understands this. If it's too tidy, it loses its juice. You'll see the character on the left show up in a different painting. And then somehow Trump became president. And this is titled Allegiance. There's a little one, it's only 8 inches square. And then we started hearing about children being separated from their parents at the southern border without information. This is a detail from a painting called Refuge. Marty might recognize the central figure is me, my senior year in college. I decided to go through the Trump years with as much light as I could find. And this is a line from a poem by William Stafford. And there's that guy again. This is an 8-inch painting called Resolve. This is titled Up to Us Now. And then COVID arrived in the United States, big time. And I spent 2 months staying away from the studio. I felt like that layered on top of everything else was getting to be too much, and painting felt trivial to me. And after a couple of months, I realized I have to get back in there, and I have to work on. I didn't want to paint people wearing masks. I wanted to look at what's possible. I painted this the week after George Floyd was murdered. And this is titled Love Conquers Hate. And then wildfires south of us pushed extremely hazardous air into Portland to where it wasn't even safe to breathe the air in your home. But we had nowhere to go for about 8 days. And I thought, well, who's responsible right now for the environment? Well, that's who's responsible. And the title of this painting is The Folly of Human Endeavor. This is a real girl. Her name's Tilda. She lived next door to me until last year. She used to come over for art day, and we would sit on my studio floor and draw together. And I had her look up for a quick photograph while she was drawing. And I think a lot about her generation and what they will be facing. And I am feeling more optimistic these days. Back to my muse here. The title of this is All Dressed Up and Nowhere to Go. I have all these cool clothes that I haven't really been wearing for a year. So she's got her cool clothes on. And you can see she's folded her head flaps up into her hat. This is the most recent painting that I've worked on. And I got to this point and I thought, well, it's well painted, but I'm not getting anything from this painting at all. And I realized I put him right in the center of the panel, and he's formed a cross with that fence. And the bottom of the fence is bisecting the composition of this. So I came back the next day after taking this picture with my iPad. And part of what you'll see is the difference between an iPad picture and a photograph with a better camera on a tripod, but also I came back and I enhanced the color. I deepened the color throughout the painting, and I enhanced the contrast, and I added the dogs. And now there's story and movement. And that is it.
Our last presenter for the evening is John Delapp. He's a photographer living in Anchorage, Alaska. His work covers a wide range of subjects and topics. I've always considered him a committed and accomplished photographer. As a recently retired engineer, John gives us his unique perspective on his COVID-19 pandemic experience through his photographs.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm doing something a little different than the rest of you. I'll be doing a quick review of a magazine that I published and produced and published online that covers the first 4 months of the COVID-19 pandemic, March through June of last year. This was mainly a journalistic project, and just so you know, I didn't get infected with the COVID, so this does not cover any experiences with having a disease. I published several of these magazines over the years, which I call Photofile, mainly to document some of my photo work and travels. They generally cover a single trip or photo project. What I'm showing tonight is the PDF file of this current 19-page magazine, and you can find a link to this PDF file and all my other magazines on my website at delappe.photography.com. I usually get about 10 copies of my magazines printed for my own use, mainly to share with family and friends, and you can order them directly from their printer, which is magcloud.com. That's magcloud.com. This information is also included on my website. And by the way, the magazines printed by MagCloud are very nicely done and only cost $5 to $8 a piece. So this is the first page. It's my introductory and short summary of the COVID impacts during the first 4 months, and also list in the lower right there my other magazines that I have. And I got interested in documenting COVID for the first 4 months because my grandfather, Werner Delappe, died at the age of 33 in the 1918 pandemic. My dad was 6 years old at the time and had a vivid memory of how sick he and his mom and dad were. They actually had people bringing them food and passing it through the window of their house in St. Louis. I also felt like I needed to document this life-changing event, and something that only happens every 100 years, it seems. And just another quick touch of more family history here that's not in the magazine. After my dad died, my dad's father died, he and his mother moved back to southeast Kansas where she had family, and she eventually remarried and became a Salisbury while my dad kept the Delappe name. And to make matters worse, during my dad's teen years, their farmhouse that they were living in at the time burned down, and they lost everything except my grandma's piano. His stepdad chopped a hole in the exterior of the wall and pulled out the piano. And my dad went on and earned advanced degrees in engineering, joined the faculty at the University of Colorado in Boulder, which is where I grew up. So back to the magazine. I kept a log during the first 4 months, documenting the spread of the virus, tracking the actions of federal, state, local authorities, and noting how my wife and I responded during these 4 months. The photos that you'll see were all made during this 4-month period. So I had a friend in town. My friend Ike from Phoenix was here in March, and he wanted to go to the Iditarod, and we have a cabin on Willow Lake. So we spent the weekend up there and photographed the beginning of the Iditarod. There were no masks or social distancing at that event, although the visitors, although the village of Shaktoolik closed their community to the mushers because of fear of the virus. Some mushers and visitors weren't able to go there. And also, as the worries about the virus grew, fans were urged not to come to Nome or for the race finish, and the mushers banquet that normally takes place was canceled. So I kept a chronology during this 4-month period, and this is the first page of it. It starts in 2017. That's some of the history with the previous administration. But by January 30th, the World Health Organization declared a virus with World Health Emergency. And of course, at that time, there was no cure or vaccine for the disease. February 12th, the stock market hit an all-time high and began free falling after that. And February 29th was the first COVID death in Seattle at that nursing home. And by then, Alaska had not seen any cases. But by March 22nd, there were active cases in every state. So here's some more pictures from the Iditarod. That's Allie Zirkle, who was unable to finish the race this year because of the injury she got, and then all of the snow that we were dealing with at Willow on that weekend. And more back to the continuing the chronology here. March was a pretty bad month for the United States. World Health Organization declares the coronavirus to be a global pandemic. Fears rise in the U.S. Events are canceled. Groceries are stripped from stores. We stock up with food and liquor. Toilet paper is hard to find. Flour and yeast are in short supply. Banks limit on how much cash can be withdrawn. On March 12th, the first case of COVID was confirmed in Alaska from that infected air cargo pilot. Also in March, New York City was in big trouble, as you recall, and was dealing with 2,000 deaths every day from the virus. And about this time, Mayor Berkowitz shuts down all non-essential businesses in Anchorage. And by the end of March, the U.S. leads the world in cases and in deaths, and there's a shortage of PPE for healthcare workers. So we were isolating at home like a lot of other people, and we had a lot of questions, probably like a lot of other people. How contagious is this virus? How vulnerable are older people? We're both in our mid-70s, so this was a big deal for us. What are the symptoms of COVID-19? How long does the virus live on surfaces? What happens if hospitals get filled with COVID patients? Where can I get a mask? We didn't have any masks at the time. When will there be therapies or a vaccine? And how will people work at home and provide schooling? This was not an issue for us, but I know that a lot of families were struggling with this problem. And some more photos here. We had an April snowstorm, which doesn't seem to be too rare in Alaska. We had a lynx prowling around the house, and I was able to jump out on the deck and get one shot of them running away. And we have the chickadees around. We have a feeder in the back, so there's always them around. And I did find some tracks that the lynx left, and that was the first set of tracks I've seen from the lynx. And more of the chronology here. March 27th, Alaska requires all arriving passengers to self-quarantine for 14 days. And by March 30th, there had been 150,000 cases in the U.S., 2,400 deaths. Corona Task Force predicted then that deaths may reach 100,000 or even 200,000, even if the best efforts are made to stop the virus. Well, in fact, by July 4th, when my chronology stops, there was 129,000 deaths. And of course, we know now that total deaths from this virus has topped 500,000. And it's not over yet. About this time, the snowshoe hares were losing their winter coats and suddenly became very visible. By April 5th, all masks are sold out in town, but our neighbor was making them and provided Tina and I with our first masks. Also, we had a tree cut down in mid-April with Paul's tree service. He was working early. His crew had to sort of shovel a spot through the snow to drag out all the slash that was there. And the roads were pretty dry, and I got my bike out. And we were able to spend some time up in Willow as soon as the snow was gone. And there was a crane family that had flown in, one of the first migrant birds, and it was fun to watch them. It was odd to see them walking on the still frozen lake, but not very solidly frozen. A little later in May, the ice had gone out. I was able to get the kayak out and spend some time in the water, photographing some of the usual birds that we see up there. And in mid-June, there was a storm coming in from the Talkeetna Mountains that eventually produced quite a bit of rain and lightning. And also in mid-June, we're starting to see the ducklings on the lake. And this set here are from the common goldeneye, and they were swimming in this kind of unusual but very perfect formation. And another short continuation of the chronology. Mid-April, President Trump planned to open up the country to normal business on May 1st and touted various unapproved treatments for COVID. Neither of these did work very well. On April 28th, I noticed the South High parking lot was filled with cars, which normally was empty. And I finally determined that it was rental cars which lacked the space at the airport due to the COVID shutdown and lack of travelers. And since we were stuck at home pretty much, either in Anchorage or in Willow, we had time to tend to our gardens, and we got some lettuce and broccoli and carrots and a raspberry patch going there. And also in May, Alaska Airlines begins requiring masks to be worn on all its flights. And by Memorial Day weekend, Alaska had 408 cases, 10 deaths, while the U.S. had 1.62 million cases and 97,000 deaths. And we had more migrant birds coming around in the summer around the house, and some of the shots that I made of them, and I was able to harvest some of our rhubarb on June 2nd, and I doubt that'll happen this year. Also about this time frame, this is the last page of the chronology, and mostly in June up to July 4th. The virus is spreading faster and up to 60,000 new cases a day in the United States. Hospitals in Arizona reach their critical capacity and forced to operate under crisis standards of care, which means some care may be restricted for some people. Several of Vice President's Secret Service agents test positive for COVID and are quarantined. And that gets us to the last page of the magazine. We celebrated our 51st anniversary on May 31st with takeout meal, which we ate at home. First time I've ever done that. And I sum up the first 4 months of this story with this statement. It is too early to predict how this will end, but it does not look good as I write this. Perhaps we'll have at least learned that politicians should never recommend drugs or remedies to the public, only health professionals. So that's it for me. I just hope everybody gets vaccinated and we get done with this problem. Thank you.
Hal.
Go ahead.
It's Sheila Wine. I have a question for Jane. So I really found it fascinating that you take these photos of people and then you distress them so that you don't have too much information to put into the painting. Do I have that correct?
Yeah. Yeah. So I'll throw them into Photoshop
Okay.
and really blur them or use a filter on them to give me enough information about where light and shadows falling, where the features are falling on the face, and use that for a while. And I get rid of color information too.
I'm curious. Do you do that to sort of erase your own memory of your encounter with them?
No, if you're talking about the photographs of real people, of the strangers,
Right.
Okay, that's different.
Okay.
I did distress those, but I think I kept the color information on those. Yeah, I don't like, my graduate degree is in medical illustration.
Of course.
So I was trained to be super tight and super precise.
Mhm.
And I've spent the next 50 years moving away from that, loosening up. So I don't like being driven by a photograph.
Mhm.
It's much more fun for me to uncover a face
Right.
than
Right.
to reproduce one.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
Any other questions? I've got one for Jane. What brought you to Juneau to begin with?
I took a trip to Juneau. I was thinking about leaving Oakland. Oakland had become pretty violent. And this was in 79 when I moved. And I took a trip to Juneau on vacation and I saw the glacier from Douglas Island. And I thought, how can I not live here? I have to live here. And I did. I was done with city, at least for the next 32 years. And also I had met the love of my life, Doug Larson, who got me the apartment next door to him. And we lived next door to each other for, I think, 3 or 4 years before we moved in together.
Lucky man. Let's see. I got a question for Oscar. First of all, where was that ice cave at?
The ice cave is just maybe about 40 minutes south of Delta. It's just off the road. I forget what they call it. Yeah, and it's actually river. It's a river that comes out from the earth and out of the ice cave.
I believe it's Castner Glacier.
Thank you.
Castner. Yeah.
That's Castner Glacier. Yeah, thank you, Joan. It's fun. It's really beautiful. It's easy to access, and in the summertime, I can't get near it because there's an energy to it that just feels like an earthquake waiting to happen, and I just can't. There's too much raw energy coming out of that thing.
Cool. So when you combine two images like you have been doing, do you think that what you're coming up with is a third thing? Maybe it's another emotion. Maybe you can expand on that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think what I discovered is when I would sit back down to this, and it was really messy. It was one of the first times I moved away from kind of like organizing catalog and systematically looking at photos and reviewing them. And I would just sit down to it and pull stuff out. And what I realized was sometimes I would recall like one image and I'm like, oh yeah, that shot that had the texture of the frost on the window of the car. And it was just the sound that I would recall, and then I'd want to connect it with a color. And so I think I am creating something that actually has a different sort of like quality to it, but it's just in my mind. I'm not sure if you all are receiving it, but it's definitely my mind, because I remember either the sensation of the cold on my body or the smell in the environment or the quality of just what was going on around me.
I think that's an important part of combining images, is to create a narrative, but without making it a concrete narrative so that when people come to it, they bring their own baggage, they create their own narrative to it. But you give them enough to do that. You know, I like to say that you give them enough rope to hang themselves. It's really,
That's well
really
said.
important. To me, it's really important to let the viewer be a part of your own work. So looking at your images, I do that. You know, I can really set up a narrative between the two images, and it brings me to some new place. So kudos on that.
Fantastic. Thank you for that feedback.
Mm.
So I had a question for Ellen. In your time exposures of the river, do you have a sense of pre-visualizing what you're going to get, or do you have a sense that, oh, if I do this for 10 seconds, I'll get this. If I do it for 30 seconds, I do that? Or is your result a pleasant surprise?
So I've actually done it often enough that I generally have a pretty good sense of what what shutter speed I'll use. It's like I don't want it to go so long that it's just all soft and it doesn't have any definition. I find like a second or two is usually long enough to give me that softness, but still retain some definition. But of course, it also depends on how strong the river is flowing. Like when it was like really high, when it was really flooded, it was a little harder to gauge the shutter speed because it was moving so swiftly. And then there was, and then sometimes I'd be battling the rain and it's like, I'm trying to like keep my gear dry and keep my footing. And so there's a lot to kind of really distract me. So in those cases, I just kind of experimented until I got the results that I wanted. So,
Well, made some magical pictures. You really captured some of that magic of moving water. It was nicely done.
well, thank you very much.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with the happy accidents. I take full credit for them when they happen for me.
Hi, this is Robin Walls of Carol and Robin. This is for Ellen. I've got to say a couple of things. I thank you for those photographs, first of all. They were just outstandingly beautiful. And the whole series at the end, I want to make sure I understand a couple of things about how you put those together. I thought you had explained that these are horizontal pictures that have been flipped vertical.
Mm-hmm.
And they are these water mirror images. Is that correct?
That it is.
Okay, so and just on a technical level, you also said you work with film. So these are not digitized images.
So there were some film images in there, but the majority of it was digital. And the mirrored ones, those were all digital.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
I just heard you refer to film, and so I was really that just piqued my interest. Anyway, with the flipped ones, I mean, I'm just going to say I just so totally love the Rorschach effect, and that I don't know, they completely transported me, and I could see so much in them, and I think I would see many things in them looking at them over and over again. So thank you. I just wanted to make that comment.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I saw a lot of aliens and bees and insects, and yeah, it felt very digitized and very weird. And actually, the first time I flipped them, I was actually a little bit stoned, so I didn't know if they were cool or not. I actually had to call a friend and say, "Are these cool, or am I just too stoned to know what's going on?"
I'm not stoned at the moment, so they're really cool.
Thank you.
Oscar, Sheila Wine, I just have a question for you. You mentioned that we have 4 seasons in Alaska, but everybody complains that we only have 2. Mm-hmm. And I wondered if you have found the same thing I have found the last year, where I have been outside every day, and it appears that you have been as well. We do have 4 seasons up here. It's just that normally we don't pay attention. And did that influence your work for this last year? To be out in those brief periods where it's like, oh, here we are, we're in fall, and I can capture this, or I can feel this and react to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I definitely feel like the transient experience of just having a life pre 2020 just had me catching glimpses of Alaska season, which is primarily, this dichotomy of like winter and summer.
Right.
But then being, big reset, just slow movement, I realized actually there's a ton more going on here, even in really tiny spaces. And that was a huge gift. It was an absolute gift.
I found it the same way, that it was a huge change. And I've been up here for way over 20 years and just hadn't spent nearly enough time outside every day. And it's one of the silver linings of the pandemic. So I'm glad that another artist has made huge use of that. Thank you very much for the work.
Okay, I got one for Jane here. You talked about combining, or you distressing the images and creating the portraits, not quite out of whole cloth, but pretty close to that. What do you think of the new development in AI portraiture? If you've heard about it, they're now able to create portraits of people, again, out of whole cloth. They don't actually exist. They're photographic quality, so they look photographic. I'm just wondering if you have any insights or opinions, or I don't know.
I love it. I think that's so cool. A couple of things personally, the characters that I invent, sometimes I see them walking around. A friend of mine said that there are really only 300 people in the world. The rest is done with mirrors. And there are about 300 faces, period. And they clone and clone and clone. The other thing is that makes me think about is that when I lived in Juneau, I called the police department at one point and I said, I think I'd be good at drawing suspects from witnesses. And so they called me in and I did about 20 of them usually from victims who've been the victims of some kind of crime. And they had what I called the Mr. Potato Kit, Mr. Potato Head Kit, but it was what was it called? The Identikit. And they had these transparent outlines of face shapes and eyes and beards and eyeglasses and female, male. And we'd look at those and talking to the witness and then I would do a drawing based on looking at the transparencies and also the drawing, and based on their descriptions of who they saw in a very traumatic moment for them, and sometimes just for a split second. And that was a fascinating thing too, because I was really inventing. The first one that I did was of a guy who lived on our street who was selling heroin. And he had a watch cap on and a mustache. In the drawing that I did, he had approached a woman with a knife. And I came home with a Xerox of that drawing. And my husband, Doug, walked in the room and he had a watch cap on and a mustache. And he looked exactly like the drawing that I had done of this guy. Another time I did a drawing, it was a murder suspect. It turned out the guy that I drew turned himself in and he wasn't the killer. But the police, the detective pulled me in and he showed me the 20 mugshots that they had pulled that looked a little bit like my drawing, and they all looked like the same person. That was fascinating. I think faces to me I just have so much fun exploring face.
Yeah, well, that's amazing. So I'll direct one to John. I've always loved your magazines, these personal magazines that you create. They're just wonderful, and on so many levels, on a personal level, on a family level, on a documentary level, especially this last series that you did. I think that's really a fantastic idea. For myself, I kind of let, if you could say it, I kind of let this pandemic just flow over me. I did nothing in response to it. It really, for me, it was just a complete downtime. But I wanted to ask you, your last entry for that magazine was in July. I wondered, did you continue on with it after July, maybe in another magazine, or maybe you're just still keeping notes?
I kind of asked myself that question. Said, why did I stop then? And I had the initiative to do the magazine at that point. Obviously, that's not the end of the story. And I have given up tracking everything like I was compelled to do in the first 4 months. I just felt like I needed to document something at the beginning of it because it was so new, it was so lethal, and it impacted our lives so greatly that I just felt like I needed to do it then. And I got tired of it, and I said, this is it. So we're still there, aren't we?
Certainly understandable. Did you being an engineer for your career, do you think that has any impact on your photography, or this project specifically? Is there any correlation there that you might have some insight on?
Well, I don't know. I suppose just putting facts together and presenting it in some sort of reasonable way that people can understand. I think that's probably mostly what it is.
Sure.
It's not really an art project per se. It's mostly a documentary, and that's really what I intended it to be.
Right.
I got other projects that are more art oriented that I haven't shown, but that's where we are.
Well, for all of our documentary filmmakers and photographers out there, documentary is an art form. So, John, I believe you can say that your work is an expression of art. So, is there anyone else that has a question out there? Okay, well, if there's no more questions, next month, May 3rd, 6 p.m., tune in to hear from and see work by photographer Myron Wright, abstract painter Graham Dane, photographer Dr. Javed Kamali, and photographer Gail Neufeld. As I hope becomes a tradition, we'll end this meeting with the obligatory hand wave and sign off from everyone. So thank you, goodbye, see you next month. Bye.
Take
Thanks.
care,
It was
y'all.
all great. Really good.
Great
Thank
seeing
you.
your faces.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Hmm.